A black boy is unjustly humiliated by the police, but they didn't know who his father was. In a small southern town where everyone knows everyone, a young black boy's dream is shattered in an instant by two overzealous police officers. But little did they know, their actions would set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of their community. What happened next shocked everyone, and the aftermath would change lives forever. Before we dive into this gripping tale, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Jamal Thompson's sneakers squeaked against the polished gym floor as he sank another perfect three-pointer. The echo of the bouncing ball reverberated through the empty high school gymnasium, a testament to the late hour and Jamal's dedication. At 17, basketball wasn't just a hobby for Jamal, it was his ticket to a brighter future. As he wiped the sweat from his brow, Jamal glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:30 p.m. He'd lost track of time again, but he couldn't help himself. With college scouts coming to the next game, every extra practice minute counted. Gathering his belongings, Jamal headed for the exit, his mind already racing with dreams of scholarships and a life beyond the confines of their small town. The cool night air hit Jamal's face as he stepped outside, a welcome relief after hours in the stuffy gym. The streets were quiet, most of the town already tucked away in their beds. Streetlights cast long shadows as Jamal began his walk home, his basketball tucked securely under one arm. But as Jamal turned onto Maple Street, the silence of the night was broken by the sudden blare of a police siren. Red and blue lights flooded the darkness, and Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He'd done nothing wrong, but years of cautionary tales from his parents echoed in his mind. Two officers emerged from the patrol car, their faces stern and unyielding. "Hold it right there, son," the taller of the two called out, his hand resting ominously on his holster. "What are you doing out so late?" Jamal's throat went dry, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "I was just heading home, sir. I had late basketball practice." The officers exchanged a skeptical glance. "ID," the shorter one demanded, holding out his hand expectantly. As Jamal reached for his wallet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a routine stop. The air crackled with tension, and something in the officer's eyes made Jamal's stomach churn with unease. Little did he know, this encounter would set in motion a series of events that would rock their small town to its core. "Basketball practice, huh?" The taller officer, whose name tag read Miller, sneered. "Funny, I didn't know breaking into cars was part of basketball training." Jamal's eyes widened in disbelief. "Breaking into? What?" "No, sir, I swear I was just at the school gym. You can call Coach Johnson if you don't believe me." Officer Reed, the shorter one, circled around Jamal, his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. A young man matching your description was seen trying car doors." Jamal's heart raced. He knew he'd done nothing wrong, but the accusation alone was terrifying. "Officers, please, there must be some mistake. I've never dash." "Hands on the car." Officer Miller suddenly barked, cutting off Jamal's protests. "Now." Confused and frightened, Jamal complied, placing his palms flat on the hood of the patrol car. The cold metal beneath his hands seemed to mirror the icy fear spreading through his chest. As Officer Reed began to pat him down roughly, Jamal caught sight of movement from the corner of his eye. A small crowd was beginning to gather, curious neighbors peering out of windows and stepping onto porches to watch the scene unfold. The shame of being publicly humiliated burned hot on Jamal's cheeks. These were people he'd known his whole life: teachers, friends' parents, the old lady who always gave out the best Halloween candy. And now they were watching him being treated like a common criminal. "Officer, please," Jamal tried again, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm telling you the truth. I'm just trying to get home." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. Officer Miller grabbed Jamal's arms, wrenching them behind his back. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed in the quiet street, a sound that would haunt Jamal's dreams for months to come. "You have the right to remain silent," Miller began reciting mechanically, but Jamal could barely hear him over the rushing in his ears. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not here. As the officers prepared to force him into the back of the patrol car, Jamal made a desperate decision. "Wait!" he cried out. "Please, I need to call my father. He needs to know what's happening." Officer Reed scoffed. "Yeah, right. So you can get your story straight?" "I don't think so, kid." But something in Jamal's pleading eyes must have sparked a flicker of doubt in Officer Miller. He hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Fine. One call. Make it quick." With shaking hands, Jamal dialed the number he knew by heart. As the phone rang, he silently prayed his father would answer. On the third ring, a familiar voice came through the line. "Jamal? What's wrong, son?" The sound of his father's voice nearly broke Jamal's composure. "Dad," he choked out, "I need help. The police. They think I've done something wrong. They're arresting me, but I swear I didn't do anything." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then, Jamal heard his father's voice, low and controlled, but with an undercurrent of steel that he'd never heard before. "Where are you?" "Maple Street," Jamal replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, I'm scared." "Listen to me, Jamal," his father said firmly. "Stay calm. Do exactly as they say, and don't argue. I'm on my way. Everything's going to be all right, son. I promise." As Officer Miller snatched the phone away, ending the call, Jamal felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest. His father was coming. Somehow, someway, he would make this right. What Jamal didn't know, what no one knew, was that this phone call would set in motion a series of events that would change everything. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a crowd of shocked and whispering neighbors, no one could have predicted the storm that was about to break over their small town. Meanwhile, across town, Jonathan Thompson sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of his responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. As the newly appointed chief of the sheriff's office, he'd been working late, poring over budget reports and staffing schedules. But all thoughts of administrative duties vanished the moment he heard the fear in his son's voice. Jonathan's mind raced as he grabbed his jacket and car keys. He'd spent years building a reputation as a fair and just law enforcement officer, slowly working his way up the ranks despite the challenges he faced as a black man in a predominantly white department. Now, in a cruel twist of fate, it was his own son who had fallen victim to the very prejudices he'd fought so hard against. As he sped towards the sheriff's office, Jonathan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He'd always known this day might come, the day when his son would face the harsh realities of being a young black man in America. But he'd hoped, prayed even, that things would be different in their small town. That the progress he'd made, the bridges he'd built, would somehow shield Jamal from this kind of injustice. Now, those hopes lay shattered, replaced by a fierce determination to right this wrong and protect his son at all costs. Little did Officers Miller and Reed know, their overzealous actions were about to bring them face to face with not just an angry father, but the very embodiment of the law they claimed to uphold. As Jonathan pulled into the parking lot of the sheriff's office, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. This was about every young person who'd ever been wrongly accused, every parent who'd ever felt helpless in the face of injustice. With renewed resolve, Jonathan stepped out of his car and strode towards the building. Inside, the night shift was quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the nearly empty bullpen. A few officers looked up as Jonathan entered, surprise registering on their faces at the sight of their chief arriving so late. But Jonathan barely noticed them, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of his son. "Where is he?" Jonathan demanded, his voice carrying an authority that made every head turn. Officer Jenkins, a veteran of the force, approached cautiously. "Chief Thompson? We weren't expecting you tonight. Is everything all right?" Jonathan fixed him with a steely gaze. "My son was brought in tonight. Jamal Thompson. Where is he?" Recognition dawned on Jenkins' face, followed quickly by confusion and then alarm. "Your son? But, Chief, I don't understand. Officers Miller and Reed brought in a suspect for attempted car theft about 20 minutes ago. They didn't say anything about..." "Where?" Jonathan repeated, his patience wearing thin. Interrogation room 2, Jenkins replied, gesturing down the hallway. Without another word, Jonathan strode purposefully towards the interrogation rooms, leaving a wake of bewildered officers behind him. As he approached room 2, he could hear muffled voices from within. His hand hesitated on the doorknob for just a moment as he gathered his composure. Then, with a swift motion, he pushed the door open. The scene that greeted him made his blood boil. Jamal sat hunched in a metal chair, his wrists still bound by handcuffs. His usually confident posture was gone, replaced by a defeated slump that broke Jonathan's heart. Officers Miller and Reed stood on either side of the table, their faces a mix of smug satisfaction and barely concealed disdain. All three heads snapped up as Jonathan entered the room. Recognition dawned on the officers' faces, quickly followed by confusion and then, as understanding set in, unmistakable fear. "CH Chief Thompson," Officer Miller stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating in an instant. "We didn't expect. We were just..." "Dad." Jamal's voice cracked with relief, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. Jonathan's gaze softened as he looked at his son, but when he turned back to the officers, his eyes were hard as flint. "Uncuff him. Now." Officer Reed fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he removed the handcuffs from Jamal's wrists. As soon as he was free, Jamal rushed into his father's arms, all pretense of toughness forgotten in the face of this ordeal. "It's okay, son," Jonathan murmured, holding Jamal tight for a moment before gently guiding him towards the door. "Wait for me outside. I need to have a word with these officers." As the door closed behind Jamal, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Jonathan turned to face Miller and Reed, his expression unreadable. "Explain yourselves," he said, his voice deceptively calm. The officers exchanged nervous glances, neither wanting to be the first to speak. Finally, Miller cleared his throat. "Sir, we received reports of suspicious activity in the area. We observed the SUS. Your son. Walking alone late at night and decided to investigate." "And at what point," Jonathan asked, his voice dangerously low, "did investigating turn into handcuffing and arresting a teenager who was simply walking home from basketball practice?" Reed shifted uncomfortably. He matched the description of. "The description of what?" Jonathan interrupted, his carefully controlled anger finally breaking through. "A young black man walking down the street? Is that enough to warrant this kind of treatment in our town?" The officers fell silent, the weight of their actions finally sinking in. Jonathan looked at each of them in turn, his disappointment palpable. "I've spent years trying to build trust between our department and the community we serve. Years of working to overcome stereotypes and prove that we're here to protect and serve everyone, regardless of the color of their skin. And in one night, you've managed to undo so much of that progress." Miller opened his mouth to protest, but Jonathan held up a hand, silencing him. "I don't want to hear excuses. What I want is for you to understand the gravity of what you've done. That young man out there? He's not just my son. He's a straight A student. A star athlete with dreams of college. A volunteer at the community center. And tonight, you made him feel like a criminal in his own neighborhood." The shame on the officers' faces was evident, but Jonathan wasn't finished. "But it's not just about Jamal. It's about every young person in this town who looks like him. Every time one of our officers acts on prejudice instead of probable cause, we lose a little more of the community's trust. And without that trust, we can't do our jobs effectively." Jonathan paused, letting his words sink in. The silence in the room was thick with tension and regret. Finally, he spoke again, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "Officers Miller and Reed, you are both suspended without pay, effective immediately. Pending a full investigation, you will be required to attend additional training on racial sensitivity and proper procedure. And depending on the outcome of that investigation, your future with this department will be reevaluated." The officers nodded mutely, knowing better than to argue. As they filed out of the room, shoulders slumped in defeat, Jonathan called after them. "Remember this feeling. Remember the look in that boy's eyes when you put those cuffs on him. And the next time you're tempted to act on a hunch instead of evidence, think about whether it's worth destroying someone's trust in the very people who are supposed to protect them. As the door closed behind the officers, Jonathan allowed himself a moment to breathe, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebbing away. He knew the coming days and weeks would be challenging. There would be questions, investigations, and likely some pushback from those who didn't understand the importance of what had transpired here tonight. But as he stepped out of the interrogation room and saw Jamal waiting for him, his son's eyes filled with a mixture of relief and admiration, Jonathan knew he had made the right choice. This decision would change everything, not just for Jamal, but for their entire community. "Let's go home, son," Jonathan said softly, placing a comforting hand on Jamal's shoulder. As they walked out of the station together, father and son both knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that their town, and perhaps the entire country, needed to have. The next morning, as the sun rose over the sleepy town, news of the previous night's events spread like wildfire. Whispers turned to heated discussions over breakfast tables and in line at the local coffee shop. The town, which had long prided itself on its close-knit community and peaceful way of life, found itself grappling with uncomfortable truths that many had chosen to ignore. Jamal woke to the smell of his father's famous pancakes wafting up the stairs. As he made his way to the kitchen, he could hear the low murmur of voices, his parents, speaking in hushed, serious tones. They fell silent as he entered, both turning to him with concerned smiles. "Morning, son," Jonathan said, sliding a plate of steaming pancakes across the counter. "How are you feeling?" Jamal shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant despite the turmoil of emotions swirling inside him. "I'm okay, I guess. Just processing everything." His mother, Evelyn, wrapped him in a tight hug. "We're here for you, baby. Whatever you need." As they sat down to eat, the reality of their new situation began to sink in. Jonathan's phone buzzed incessantly with messages and missed calls. The local news station had already reached out for a statement. And through the window, Jamal could see a small group of reporters gathered at the end of their driveway, cameras at the ready. "What happens now?" Jamal asked, pushing his half-eaten pancakes around his plate. Jonathan sighed, running a hand over his face. "Now, we face this head-on. There's going to be an investigation into what happened last night. It won't be easy, but it's necessary if we want things to change." Jamal nodded slowly, a determined look settling over his features. "I want to help, Dad. I want to tell my story." Evelyn reached out, squeezing her son's hand. "Are you sure, honey? It could be tough, having everyone know what happened." "I'm sure," Jamal replied, his voice steady. "If it helps prevent this from happening to someone else, then it's worth it." Jonathan felt a surge of pride for his son's courage. "All right then. We'll do this together." As the day wore on, the Thompson family found themselves at the center of a media storm. Jonathan's phone rang off the hook with calls from reporters, community leaders, and fellow law enforcement officers. Some offered support, while others demanded explanations or resignations. By afternoon, the family decided it was time to address the situation publicly. They agreed to a press conference on the steps of the sheriff's office, a decision that sent the town into a frenzy of anticipation. As they pulled up to the sheriff's office, Jamal's stomach churned with nerves. The crowd that had gathered was larger than he'd expected, a sea of faces, some familiar, some not, all turned towards them expectantly. Cameras flashed and reporters called out questions as they made their way to the podium. Jonathan stepped up first, his uniform crisp and his expression resolute. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "I stand before you today not just as your chief of police, but as a father, a member of this community, and a black man who has experienced firsthand the prejudices that still plague our society." He went on to recount the events of the previous night, his words painting a vivid picture of the injustice Jamal had faced. As he spoke, Jamal could see the shock and dismay on many faces in the crowd. Some nodded in grim understanding, while others looked away, uncomfortable with the harsh truth being laid bare. "What happened to my son is not an isolated incident," Jonathan continued, his voice growing more impassioned. "It is a symptom of a larger problem, one that we can no longer afford to ignore. As your chief of police, I have failed if even one member of our community feels unsafe or unfairly targeted because of the color of their skin." A murmur rippled through the crowd at these words. Jonathan pressed on, undeterred. "Effective immediately, Officers Miller and Reed have been suspended pending a full investigation. But this is just the first step. We will be implementing comprehensive bias training for all our officers, reviewing our policies and procedures, and working closely with community leaders to rebuild the trust that has been broken." As Jonathan stepped back from the podium, he turned to Jamal, giving him an encouraging nod. This was the moment they had discussed, the opportunity for Jamal to share his story in his own words. Taking a deep breath, Jamal approached the microphone. "My name is Jamal Thompson," he began, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. "Last night, I was wrongfully arrested while walking home from basketball practice. I was scared, humiliated, and treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of my skin." Jamal's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his experience. He could see tears in the eyes of some listeners, while others shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own biases reflected in his story. "But I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame," Jamal continued. "I'm here because I believe in our community. I believe we can do better. I want to live in a town where no one has to fear walking home at night, where the police are truly here to protect and serve all of us." As Jamal finished speaking, a hush fell over the crowd. Then, slowly, applause began to build. It started with a few hesitant claps, but soon swelled into a thunderous show of support. Jamal felt a lump form in his throat as he looked out at the sea of faces, neighbors, teachers, friends, all united in this moment of shared purpose. The press conference marked a turning point for the town. In the days and weeks that followed, conversations that had long been avoided were finally brought to the forefront. Community meetings were held, where people from all walks of life came together to share their experiences and brainstorm solutions. The investigation into Officers Miller and Reed's conduct was thorough and transparent. In the end, the decision was made to terminate their employment with the sheriff's office. It was a difficult choice, one that sparked debate and controversy, but Jonathan stood firm in his commitment to accountability. For Jamal, life slowly began to return to a new normal. He threw himself into his schoolwork and basketball with renewed determination, his dreams of college burning brighter than ever. But he also found himself drawn to a new purpose. He began speaking at local schools about his experience, encouraging young people to stand up against injustice and work towards positive change in their communities. One evening, a few months after that fateful night, Jamal and Jonathan sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, a peaceful contrast to the turmoil they had faced. "You know, Dad," Jamal said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. About how one night changed so much." Jonathan nodded, encouraging his son to continue. "At first, I was so angry," Jamal admitted. "Angry at those officers, at the unfairness of it all. But now, I think I'm grateful, in a way." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Grateful?" Jamal smiled, a wisdom beyond his years shining in his eyes. "Yeah. Grateful that we had the chance to make a difference. That we could take something painful and turn it into something positive for our whole community." Jonathan felt a swell of pride for his son. "You're right, Jamal. Change is never easy, but it's always possible when good people stand up for what's right." As they sat there, father and son, the weight of their shared experience hung between them. But there was also hope for a better future, not just for their family, but for their entire community. Little did they know, their story was just beginning to ripple out beyond the borders of their small town. In the coming months, their experience would inspire conversations and changes in communities across the country, proving that even in the darkest moments, there is always the potential for growth, understanding, and positive change. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, Jamal and Jonathan sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The chirping of crickets filled the air, a soothing soundtrack to their quiet contemplation. Jamal's mind wandered to the upcoming basketball game. College scouts would be there, and despite everything that had happened, his dream of earning a scholarship was still very much alive. But now, that dream was accompanied by a new sense of purpose, a desire to use his voice and his experiences to make a difference. Jonathan, watching his son from the corner of his eye, marveled at the young man Jamal was becoming. The incident that could have broken his spirit had instead ignited a fire within him, a determination to fight for justice and equality. As if reading his father's thoughts, Jamal spoke up. "Dad, I've been thinking about my future. About college and beyond." Jonathan turned to face his son, giving him his full attention. "What's on your mind, son?" Jamal took a deep breath before continuing. "I still want to play basketball, to get that scholarship. But I also think I want to study law." A smile spread across Jonathan's face, a mixture of surprise and pride. "Law, huh? That's a big decision. What brought this on?" "Everything that's happened," Jamal replied, his voice filled with conviction. "Seeing how the law can be used to hurt people, but also how it can protect them. I want to be part of making sure it does more of the latter." Jonathan nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his son's words. "It won't be an easy path, Jamal. The system isn't perfect, and changing it from within can be a long, frustrating process." "I know," Jamal said, meeting his father's gaze. "But someone has to do it, right? And who better than someone who's seen both sides, who knows what it's like to be wrongly accused, but also has a father who's shown him how law enforcement can be a force for good." Jonathan felt a lump form in his throat, touched by his son's words and the depth of thought behind them. "You're right, son. And I have no doubt that if anyone can make a difference, it's you." As they continued to talk, discussing the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead, neither of them noticed the figure approaching their house. It wasn't until they heard footsteps on the walkway that they looked up, surprised to see Officer Jenkins, one of the veteran cops from the sheriff's office, making his way towards them. "Chief Thompson," Jenkins called out, his voice hesitant. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I was hoping I could have a word with you and Jamal, if that's all right." Jonathan and Jamal exchanged a quick glance before Jonathan nodded. "Of course, Jenkins. Come on up." As Jenkins climbed the porch steps, Jamal could see the nervous energy radiating off the older man. He fidgeted with his hat, turning it over in his hands as he struggled to find the right words. I wanted to apologize," Jenkins finally said, his eyes darting between Jonathan and Jamal. "I was there that night, at the station. I didn't do anything to stop what was happening, and I should have. I've been doing a lot of thinking since then, and, well, I realized I've been part of the problem for a long time without even realizing it." Jamal felt a mix of emotions wash over him: surprise, a flicker of the old anger, but also a growing respect for the officer's honesty. Jenkins continued, his voice growing stronger. "I've been on the force for 20 years, and I've always prided myself on being one of the good ones. But the truth is, I've turned a blind eye to a lot of things I shouldn't have. What happened to you, Jamal? It made me realize that not doing wrong isn't enough. We have to actively do what's right." Jonathan nodded, a look of understanding passing between the two veteran officers. "Thank you for saying that, Jenkins. It takes courage to admit when we've been wrong." "I want to do better," Jenkins said firmly. "I want to be part of the change. I've been talking to some of the other officers, and we want to start a mentorship program, working with kids in the community, building trust. We were hoping you might be willing to help us get it off the ground, Jamal." Jamal's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? But I'm just a high school student." Jenkins smiled, some of his nervousness fading. "You're a lot more than that, son. You're a voice for change, someone who can bridge the gap between the police and the young people in our community. Your perspective would be invaluable." As Jamal considered the offer, he felt a surge of excitement. This was an opportunity to make a real difference, to be part of the solution he'd been talking about. He looked to his father, seeking guidance. Jonathan met his son's gaze with a proud smile. "It's your decision, Jamal. But I think you have a lot to offer." Jamal turned back to Jenkins, a determined look in his eyes. I'd be honored to help, Officer Jenkins. When do we start? As Jenkins left that evening, plans already forming for the new mentorship program, Jamal and Jonathan found themselves filled with a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead would not be easy, but they were ready to face the challenges together, knowing that with each small step, they were moving towards a better, more just future. The story of Jamal Thompson and his father, Chief Jonathan Thompson, didn't end on that porch. In fact, it was just the beginning of a journey that would inspire change far beyond the borders of their small town. In the months that followed, Jamal threw himself into his dual passions with equal fervor. On the basketball court, he played with a fire that caught the eye of college scouts, his dreams of a scholarship inching closer to reality with each game. But it was off the court where Jamal truly began to shine. The mentorship program, born from that conversation with Officer Jenkins, quickly grew into something bigger than anyone had anticipated. Jamal became a bridge between the police department and the youth of the community, organizing basketball games where kids and cops played side by side, breaking down barriers and building understanding. Word of the program's success spread, and soon other towns were reaching out, eager to implement similar initiatives. Jamal found himself traveling to speak at schools and community centers, sharing his story and inspiring others to be agents of change in their own communities. As his senior year drew to a close, Jamal faced a decision that would shape the course of his future. Offers had come in from several prestigious universities, each presenting a unique opportunity. But it was a letter from Howard University's law school that caught his eye: the full scholarship, with the chance to be part of a program focused on civil rights and social justice. The night Jamal made his decision, he sat down with his parents, the acceptance letter clutched in his hand. "I think this is it," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Howard, it feels right." Jonathan and Evelyn exchanged a proud glance. "We support you 100%, son," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. As Jamal prepared for the next chapter of his life, Jonathan too found himself at a crossroads. The changes he had implemented in the sheriff's office had not been without challenges. There had been resistance from some quarters, officers who were slow to adapt to the new policies and community members who felt the changes were either too much or not enough. But Jonathan stood firm, his commitment to justice unwavering. His leadership caught the attention of state officials, and he soon found himself being courted for a position that would allow him to implement his vision for community-oriented policing on a much larger scale. The day Jonathan announced his decision to accept the position of state police commissioner was bittersweet. He had grown to love the community he had served for so long, but he knew that this was an opportunity to effect change on a broader level. As father and son packed up their respective lives, preparing for new adventures in different cities, they couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The night that had seemed like their darkest moment had become the catalyst for positive change, not just for them, but for countless others. On Jamal's last night in town, the community gathered for a send-off celebration. The high school gym was packed, a sea of familiar faces all there to wish Jamal well. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, Jamal felt a swell of emotion. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed gymnasium, "I stood on the steps of the sheriff's office, angry and hurt, unsure of what the future held. Today, I stand before you filled with hope and gratitude." Jamal's eyes found his father in the crowd, and he smiled. "What happened to me was painful, but it opened my eyes to the work that still needs to be done in our country. It showed me the power we all have to make a difference, to stand up for what's right, and to be the change we want to see in the world." As Jamal continued his speech, weaving together themes of justice, community, and hope, the crowd hung on his every word. In that moment, it was clear to everyone present that they were witnessing the beginning of something special: the emergence of a young leader whose voice would resonate far beyond the boundaries of their small town. When Jamal finished speaking, the applause was deafening. As he made his way through the crowd, accepting hugs and well wishes, he caught sight of a familiar face. Officer Jenkins stood near the back of the gym, a proud smile on his face. As their eyes met, Jenkins gave Jamal a respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come and the work still left to do. Later that night, as Jamal and Jonathan sat on their porch one last time, the weight of the impending changes hung in the air between them. But there was also a sense of excitement, of possibility. "You know, Dad," Jamal said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking about something you once told me. About how change is never easy, but it's always possible when good people stand up for what's right." Jonathan nodded, remembering the conversation. "That's right, son. Why do you bring it up?" Jamal's eyes shone with determination in the dim porch light. "Because I think we're just getting started. What happened here, in our town, it's just the beginning. There's so much more work to be done, so many more people who need to hear this message." Jonathan felt a surge of pride at his son's words. "You're right, Jamal. And I have a feeling you're going to be at the forefront of that change." As they sat there, father and son, the weight of this shared experience hung between them. But there was also hope for a better future, not just for their family, but for communities across the country. The next morning dawned bright and early, the moving truck rumbling in the driveway as the Thompson family prepared for their new beginnings. Neighbors stopped by to say their goodbyes, many with tears in their eyes, expressing how much the family's presence had meant to the community. As Jamal loaded the last of his boxes into the car, he paused, taking in the sight of the house he'd grown up in. So much had changed in the past year, and yet, in many ways, it felt like everything was just beginning. "You ready, son?" Jonathan called from the driver's seat. Jamal took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Yeah, Dad. I'm ready." As they pulled out of the driveway, Jamal couldn't help but think about the journey ahead. Howard University awaited him, with its rich history of civil rights activism and legal scholarship. He knew the path he had chosen wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared for the challenge. Meanwhile, Jonathan's thoughts were on his new role as state police commissioner. The position came with immense responsibility, but also the power to implement real, systemic change. He was determined to use this platform to address the deep-rooted issues of bias and discrimination in law enforcement. As they drove through town one last time, Jamal noticed something that made his heart swell with emotion. On nearly every street corner, in shop windows, and on car bumpers, he saw signs and stickers bearing a simple but powerful message: "Be the change." It was a phrase he had used in his speech at the send-off celebration, a call to action for everyone in the community to play their part in creating a more just and equitable society. Seeing it displayed so prominently throughout the town was a powerful reminder of the impact one voice could have. "Look, Dad," Jamal said, pointing out the window at the signs. Jonathan smiled, nodding in acknowledgement. "Looks like you've left quite a mark on this town, son." As they reached the town limits, Jamal felt a mixture of sadness and excitement wash over him. He was leaving behind the only home he'd ever known, but he was also embarking on an adventure that held the promise of real, meaningful change. "You know," Jamal said, turning to his father, "I've been thinking about what I want to focus on in law school." "Oh?" Jonathan replied, glancing at his son curiously. Jamal nodded, his voice filled with conviction. "I want to specialize in civil rights law. I want to be there for kids like me, who find themselves in situations where the system is stacked against them. I want to be their voice." Jonathan reached over, squeezing his son's shoulder. "That's a noble goal, Jamal. And I have no doubt you'll make it happen." As the miles rolled by, father and son talked about their hopes and dreams for the future. They discussed the challenges they would face, the resistance they might encounter, but also the potential for real, lasting change. Jamal shared his ideas for expanding the mentorship program he had started with Officer Jenkins, envisioning a nationwide network that could bridge the gap between law enforcement and communities of color. Jonathan, in turn, outlined his plans for implementing comprehensive bias training across the state police force, as well as initiatives to increase diversity in recruitment and promotion. As they talked, it became clear that while their paths were diverging, their goals were very much aligned. Both father and son were committed to using their experiences and positions to push for a more just and equitable society. Hours into their journey, they stopped at a small diner for lunch. As they slid into a booth, Jamal noticed a TV mounted on the wall, tuned to a news channel. The anchor was discussing a familiar story, their story. In a follow-up to a story we've been covering, Jamal Thompson, the young man at the center of a controversial police encounter last year, is heading to Howard University on a full scholarship, the anchor reported. Meanwhile, his father, Jonathan Thompson, has been appointed as the new state police commissioner with a mandate to implement sweeping reforms in law enforcement practices. Jamal and Jonathan exchanged a look, both somewhat uncomfortable with the attention but also aware of the importance of keeping their story in the public eye. As they ate their meal, they couldn't help but overhear the conversations around them. People were discussing their story, debating the merits of police reform, and sharing their own experiences with law enforcement. It was a stark reminder of the ripple effect their actions had caused. What had started as a traumatic incident in a small town had sparked a national conversation about race, policing, and justice. As they prepared to leave the diner, an elderly woman approached their table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Are you the Thompsons? From the news?" Jamal and Jonathan nodded, unsure of what to expect. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she spoke. "I just wanted to thank you. My grandson. He had an experience similar to yours, Jamal. But he didn't have anyone to stand up for him. What you're doing, it gives me hope that things can change." Touched by the woman's words, Jamal stood and gave her a hug. "Thank you," he said softly. "We're going to keep fighting for change, I promise." As they got back on the road, both Jamal and Jonathan were quiet, reflecting on the encounter in the diner. It was a powerful reminder of why their work was so important and the impact it could have on lives across the country. "You know, Dad," Jamal said after a while, "I've been thinking about something. About how one moment, one decision, can change everything." Jonathan nodded, encouraging his son to continue. "That night, when those officers stopped me, it could have gone so differently," Jamal continued. "If you hadn't been the chief, if you hadn't taught me how to handle myself in those situations, who knows what might have happened." Jonathan's grip tightened on the steering wheel, the memory of that night still painful. "You're right, son. And that's why what we're doing is so important. Because not everyone has the advantages you had in that moment." Jamal nodded solemnly. "Exactly. And that's why I want to use my voice, my education, everything I have, to fight for those who don't have those advantages. To make sure that one day, no one has to fear walking home at night just because of the color of their skin." As they continued their journey, the conversation shifted to the future. They discussed the challenges that lay ahead, the resistance they would likely face, the slow pace of systemic change, the potential backlash from those resistant to reform. But for every challenge they identified, they also saw opportunity. The chance to educate, to build bridges, to create lasting change that could impact generations to come. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jamal found himself filled with a sense of purpose and determination. The road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. "You know, Dad," he said, a small smile playing on his lips, "I have a feeling this is just the beginning of our story." Jonathan glanced at his son, seeing not just the boy he had raised, but the man he was becoming, a leader, an advocate, a force for change. "I think you're right, son," he replied. "This is just the beginning." As they drove into the fading light, father and son, each headed towards their own new beginnings, they carried with them the hope of a better future, not just for themselves, but for all those who would come after them. Little did they know, their journey was about to inspire a movement that would sweep across the nation, challenging long-held assumptions, bridging divides, and paving the way for a more just and equitable society. But that, as they say, is a story for another day. As the credits roll and the screen fades to black, we're left with a powerful message of hope, resilience, and the potential for positive change. Jamal and Jonathan's story reminds us that even in the face of injustice, we have the power to make a difference. It challenges us to examine our own biases, to stand up for what's right, and to be the change we wish to see in the world. So, what do you think? Would you have had the courage to turn a negative experience into a catalyst for change like Jamal did? How would you have reacted in Jonathan's position? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring content. Remember, change starts with each one of us. So let's go out there and make a difference, one step at a time.